Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson, and with us tonight we have Luther Weeks. We're going to discuss two issues. One is election integrity, and the other is instant runoff voting, which I'm sure some of the audience members have heard something about, but we're going to clarify a lot of the issues about that. Luther, tell us who you are and what your involvement on these subjects is.
Sure. I'm Executive Director of Connecticut Voters Count, and we stand for election integrity in Connecticut for the benefit of the voters in Connecticut. And said in a simpler way, we want to make sure your vote counts, it's counted accurately, and it's counted exactly once.
Fair enough. Fair enough. What is the procedure for doing this? What's the procedure for auditing the votes? How many votes are audited? How is it done? What's the mandate that's been put in place by the legislature?
Yeah, sure. You know, we vote on the optical scanners, and to make sure that those count accurately, then the idea is to count enough of the paper in the right way after the election. And we have an election law passed in 2007, and the Secretary of State picks 10% of the polling places in Connecticut. We call them districts here. And in those, depending on the election, typically there's a randomly selected 3 races to be audited. And then each of the towns that have districts selected, it's their job to count the votes and report that result to the Secretary of State.
Now, I participated in a number of these recounts, and I can speak to how, in addition to the optical scanner counting each vote, there's also it's about an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. It's roughly 8.5 by 11 size sheet of paper that people actually take into the polling spot, into the booth, and mark with a pencil. Very clear, very easy to mark for each race in the election. The explanation on it is pretty clear cut, and then you put it in a folder so that it's covered up from anybody's view, brought up to the person that actually enters it into the machine that counts it, and you can watch your vote being counted. While your vote's being counted, you can watch the number counter on the machine actually click up 1.
Yeah.
So you can see that your vote was counted. It's pretty cool. What beyond that technically is involved in the actual voting process?
Okay, well, obviously you were registered as a voter, so they have to make sure that you are registered to vote. And then you may make a mistake, or you may decide to, you didn't vote right, and so we have to give you another ballot, and we have to keep track of the ballots to make sure that there weren't extra ballots taken and that type of thing. So then after the machine reads it, then the machine prints out a tape at the end of the night in that polling place. And there's also votes that weren't counted in that polling place by the machine. There may be some in that polling place that have to be counted by hand. In larger towns, all the absentee ballots are counted in a central location, and then those are all accumulated by hand in town hall and then sent to the Secretary of State's office.
Okay, now how is this beneficial on election night? Because, of course, we want to know when the poll closes, we want to know instantaneously, if at all possible, who won each election.
Yeah.
How do they, you mentioned you have the tape, which has the count, I presume, for every candidate for each machine. Do they have to go back and make a physical calculation on a separate sheet of paper to identify how many votes each candidate got from each machine?
Yeah, you're hit on one of the unique concerns in Connecticut. Now, in other states, they submit that results electronically to a central location, or they may take the memory card out of the scanner, which has the election program on it and also election results, and bring those to a central location and add the data up. Now, that's quite controversial because electronic transmission is risky. Someone could intercept that card. There's a lot of opportunities for error. On the other hand, in Connecticut, we take that tape, and really between the results that happen in the polling place and the results you see posted on the Secretary of State's office, There may be 256 numbers added up, a lot of manual transcription. And so when you do manual transcription, manual addition, especially late at night after 17-hour days of poll worker, there's an opportunity for error. But that's that's what happens to our ballots, and that's one of the reasons that you need to check things, and we need to check things.
So you have your registrars at the end of the evening that settle in at a table with representatives from each candidate in any given election and manually calculate from, let's say, in the polling place that I go to, there's maybe 3 machines, and they calculate each tape from each of the 3 machines. They'll come up with a figure for, in the case of this year, we have selectmen and mayors are voted on. So, for instance, a selectman's race, they'll calculate from each of the 3 machines. How do they get their numbers from multiple polling areas? Because they say from Bethel, for instance, there are 3 separate polling areas.
Sure. Now, there's a person that's in charge of each polling place, and they're called a moderator.
Moderator, okay.
Okay, and the moderator makes up what's called the moderator's return, and what that has on it is a hand transcription of the numbers on the tape, and then also places for the hand-counted ballots.
Yep.
And then those are added up in the polling place, and that completes the moderator's return. But then late at night, they take it into the town hall typically, and there's a person designated as the head moderator. And the head moderator's job is to create a report that consolidates all the data from all the polling places. And if, typically if they're doing a good job, they will check over what each of the moderators has done to make sure that, there wasn't a clerical error in the process. Right. And then that is the report that gets sent to the Secretary of State's office.
Now, for a small town like Bethel, for instance, comparing to a large city like Hartford, let's say, are there more people involved in a city like Hartford than there are in a town like Bethel, where you have a far smaller population, far smaller voting population?
Sure. I think you usually have half a dozen to 10 people in each polling place. So I believe Hartford has about 22 polling places. So multiply those together, and then you have this central function of the registrars and the head moderator and maybe a couple other people helping out. But typically in Bethel, you need those same 6, 8 people in the polling place. You have the advantage that the registrar is going to be right there as well. So you don't have the communication difficulties and things like that. But we also have middle-sized towns. They have very huge single polling places, maybe 4,000, 5,000 votes in one polling place, because there's a lot of reason where you don't want to have 2 polling places, because once you put in that overhead of having 2 places or 3 places, it makes it more complex. However, they have a lot of ballots. Probably
more less cost efficient too. There's probably that plays into it a little bit too. Now, when does a town or a city arrive at an unofficial count, and when does it arrive at an official count during the evening when they tabulate everything up?
Really, the count for the evening is really the initial count that's reported, and quite often they'll go over that again in the next 2 or 3 days and look for errors and correct that if there were clerical errors, and send it into the Secretary of State.
Okay. Now let's move on to the part that happens later on. And this year it's happening, you said, on November 18th, where we do the actual mandated recounts of a percentage of the votes calculated in the state to make sure that the system is working correctly. Tell us about that.
Okay. So the basic process is a few days before that, November 18th, the Secretary of State will select randomly 10% of the districts in the state. Last year that we had 833 districts. That goes up and down slightly from year to year. And 10% of that was 84 districts that were selected for audit. And then in this municipal election coming up, let's say Hartford with 22 gets hit with 2 districts to audit, then the town clerk would select randomly 3 of the races on the ballot to be audited.
Okay.
And then Hartford would choose within a date range the Secretary of State sets. I believe it'll probably be about November 18th to December 1st or 2nd, and Hartford will count those ballots for those 2 districts in the 3 races that were randomly selected. And we have a lot of concerns with that process and the way it's designed and then actually the way it works.
Before you go into that, I want to make it it's a very